Our world was once a place without a single written word. This is the story of how a simple invention forged the mightiest empires in history. You will discover the hidden link between ancient manuscripts and ultimate power, revealing how knowledge became the true architect of civilization. How did a collection of clay tablets allow one king to guide millions? What insight did medieval monks preserve that would one day reshape the world? We are about to trace the epic journey from the first scroll to the sprawling digital networks of today. What do you believe is the most powerful idea ever written down? But the true power of these marks was not just in making lists. It was in the ability to hold a thought unchanged across centuries. Imagine a city administrator in ancient Sumer, able to consult the tax records from his grandfather's time. Or a priest reciting a prayer, knowing each word matched the original inscription exactly. This permanence created a new kind of memory, one that did not fade with the passing of a human life. Suddenly, knowledge became a tangible asset, something that could be accumulated, organized, and controlled. The earliest writings were deeply practical, tracking grain stores and property lines, but they soon captured the very soul of a culture. Laws were carved into stone steels for all to see, creating a unified code of justice that extended the ruler's voice to the farthest corners of his domain. Epic tales of gods and heroes, once subject to the whims of a storyteller's memory, were fixed in clay, giving a people a shared identity and a common past. This was the genesis of a stable foundation, a platform upon which something far grander could be built. How could such scattered records, however, ever be gathered into a single source of ultimate power? The answer would emerge from the silent halls of the first great libraries. A king's command could now echo across generations, but this new power demanded a fortress. The written word, so fragile on clay and papyrus, needed a sanctuary. This was the birth of the library, an institution that transformed scattered records into a concentrated tool of state. In the ancient city of Nineveh, the Assyrian ruler Ashurbanipal assembled a collection of staggering scope. His library housed thousands of cuneiform tablets, a complete archive of the known world. Here, scribes did not simply stack clay. They actively managed the empire's knowledge, copying astronomical charts, medical recipes, and administrative manuals. This was an intellectual command center where information from distant territories was translated, studied, and integrated. By absorbing the wisdom of other cultures, they enriched their own traditions and streamlined the machinery of governance. The library became a quiet instrument, turning the accumulated learning of many peoples into a foundation for lasting influence. This model of centralized knowledge reached its height with the legendary Library of Alexandria. It was designed not just to hold scrolls, but to attract the finest thinkers across the Mediterranean. Under its roof, scholars examined texts on engineering, calculated the Earth's circumference, and pioneered new fields of geometry. These were not abstract academic pursuits. Every innovation in mapping directly aided exploration and planning. Every advance in mechanics improved construction and infrastructure. The gathering of scrolls was the gathering of potential, a direct fuel for cultural ambition. A ruler who controlled the world's knowledge could, in a very real sense, begin to shape the world itself. But how could this immense, centralized power, locked within palace and temple walls, ever flow outward to the common person? The answer was already taking shape, not in a king's court, but in the quiet dedication of solitary scribes. A single scribe, hunched over a parchment in a silent stone room, held more quiet influence than a legion of soldiers. His quill did not conquer land, but it captured the very laws and logistics that allowed an empire to exist. In the cold scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, this work was a sacred calling. For years, a monk might labor on a single volume, his hands tracing letters by flickering candlelight. He was not merely copying words, he was preserving the foundational knowledge of the Western world, from the philosophy of Aristotle to the medical texts of Galen, through an era often called the Dark Ages. Without this dedicated, anonymous work, the intellectual light of classical antiquity might have been lost forever. These individuals formed the indispensable human infrastructure of every great civilization. Beyond the monastery walls, court scribes were the administrative engine of the state. They recorded tax yields from distant provinces, drafted legal decrees that carried the force of law, and composed the delicate diplomatic letters that could prevent a war. A king could command an army, but only a scribe could make that command legible, replicable, and enforceable across 1,000 miles. Their role demanded far more than simple literacy. A skilled scribe needed a deep understanding of mathematics to manage treasury accounts, a command of rhetoric to frame persuasive edicts, and a mastery of law to ensure every document was legally sound. This expertise made them trusted advisors, the keepers of state secrets that could secure a throne or topple a dynasty. They were the guardians of institutional memory, ensuring that the complex machinery of government did not grind to a halt with the passing of each ruler. The meticulous, lifelong labor of these scholars ensured the flame of learning was never extinguished. They transformed knowledge from a fragile spark into a steady, banked fire, patiently waiting for the moment it would be needed to forge a new age. A Byzantine emperor did not merely command armies, he commanded information. In the hushed chambers of his palace, strategists pored over detailed maps of mountain passes and river crossings, planning campaigns years in advance. They studied reports on the customs and internal dynamics of rival states, looking for any opportunity to strengthen their own position. Translations of captured documents revealed the intentions of others long before their forces began to move. This was knowledge wielded as a precise instrument of statecraft, a strategic advantage that secured the empire's frontiers for generations. The greatest leaders understood that success was not just won on the battlefield, but in the careful study of geography, logistics, and human nature. A well-documented trade route could supply a distant legion more effectively than any single clash. Understanding seasonal patterns ensured that armies moved when the land could sustain them, and that strongholds were built where they would endure the longest. The construction of a single siege engine relied upon generations of writings about engineering, mathematics, and material science. This was the quiet, systematic work that turned abstract learning into tangible influence. Spies were not just lone agents, they were part of a wider system of gathering insight, where coded messages and the study of foreign records created a decisive edge. An empire that could foresee a rival's next step, build an alliance by appreciating a distant culture's values, or influence an opponent's supply through economic strategy, could achieve its aims with a sophistication that raw strength could never equal. The pen in these hands was not merely a writing tool, it was a lever that moved the world, and this strategic control of knowledge would soon reveal its ultimate expression, not in the hands of a king, but in the mind of an inventor. An empire's wealth was measured in more than just gold and grain. It was tallied in the ink of ledgers and the lines of maps. Across the known world, prosperity became a direct function of recorded knowledge, a silent engine driving the ambitions of kings and merchants alike. In the bustling harbors of the Hanseatic League, a merchant's trust was not merely a handshake. It was bound within meticulously kept ledgers and guaranteed by standardized weights. Navigational charts, carefully copied and updated, turned the unpredictable North Sea into a reliable highway for commerce. This network of shared information and reliable accounting created a commercial power so vast it could negotiate treaties and field its own forces, rivaling the authority of the kingdoms it operated between. The true revolution, however, was born in the counting houses of medieval Italy. The development of double-entry bookkeeping introduced a simple yet profound clarity. For every credit, there was a corresponding debit. This system created an unbroken chain of accountability, allowing investors in Venice to confidently fund a trading voyage to Alexandria. It built the trust necessary for complex financial instruments like letters of credit, freeing capital from strongboxes and setting it in motion across continents. This very flow of capital would one day fund the great voyages of exploration and the overseas ventures that reshaped the globe. Behind every imperial monument stood an administration focused on data. A Roman census was not merely a count of people, it was a deep survey of an empire's human and economic potential. Detailed land surveys recorded soil quality and crop yields, allowing authorities to refine a tax system that was both predictable and sustainable. This river of information directed resources to where they were most needed, funding public works that strengthened society itself. Aqueducts brought fresh water to growing cities, while state granaries ensured a reserve against difficult seasons. By managing data, empires managed stability, creating the agricultural surplus and population growth that fueled their grandeur. This entire economic machinery, from the merchant's ledger to the imperial census, generated the surplus wealth that built temples, raised legions, and patronized the arts. It was a wealth built not on conquest alone, but on the meticulous, unglamorous work of recording, calculating, and planning. And this vast, organized prosperity demanded a new kind of structure to protect it, a framework of laws that could turn fleeting advantage into enduring legacy. A stone pillar standing in a public square did more than list rules. It transformed the very idea of justice from a local memory into an imperial fact. The Code of Hammurabi, carved for all to see, announced that the law was no longer just the custom of one village or the whim of a local chieftain. It was now a unified system, a promise of order that applied to everyone under the king's authority. For a merchant traveling from a distant city, this was a profound assurance. His trade, his property, and his very safety were now backed by a code that any official in any town was bound to uphold. This written law became the silent administrator of the realm, standardizing consequences, defining property rights, and establishing clear steps to resolve a disagreement. It reduced the chaos of internal conflict by replacing personal retaliation with public procedure, fostering a sense of shared identity and security that bound diverse populations together. How could a single ruler ensure his decrees were followed consistently across 1,000 miles of territory? The written word was his answer. By committing the law to stone and later to papyrus, a king could dispatch identical copies to every provincial governor and judge. This act alone curbed the potential for corruption, as no local authority could easily distort a law that was plainly written and widely known. It reinforced the central government's control, making the distant voice of the king the ultimate arbiter in every courtroom and marketplace. This created a predictable environment where commerce could flourish and communities could plan for the future, because the rules of society were no longer a mystery. The stability this provided was a cornerstone of imperial longevity. Centuries later, the Justinian Code would perform this same function for the Byzantine Empire, gathering centuries of Roman legal wisdom into a single, organized body of work. This was not merely an archive, It was an active tool for governance, ensuring that the sophisticated legal principles of Rome would guide judges for generations, long after the Western Empire had faded. The law, once written down, outlived the kings who proclaimed it. It became the enduring skeleton of the state, a framework of order so vital that its principles would one day be rediscovered and would help to shape the modern world. This legal stability, however, relied on a common tongue, a shared language that could carry the weight of law and unite an empire's many voices. A single language could bind an empire more firmly than any fortress wall. Across the sprawling territories of Rome, Latin became the common tongue of law, commerce, and command. Imagine a merchant from Gaul negotiating a contract in a port of North Africa, a tax collector in Egypt reading the same imperial edict as an officer stationed in Britain, and a local administrator in Hispania filing a report using the same bureaucratic formulas. They might never lose their native accents or local traditions, but they all participated in a shared system of communication that made the vast machinery of the state function. This linguistic unity was no accident. It was a deliberate and powerful instrument of cohesion, turning a mosaic of different peoples into a unified political entity with a common Roman identity. The imperial chancery was the engine of this project, a sophisticated bureaucracy that produced a constant flow of documents. Standardized manuals dictated the exact procedure for enrolling a new legionary or assessing a farmer's grain tax, ensuring that a governor in one province operated by the same rules as his counterpart 1,000 miles away. This created an administrative resilience that could endure beyond the reign of individual emperors because the system itself was encoded in writing. The ability to draft clear, unambiguous instructions was paramount. A misunderstood order could lead to a failed military campaign or local unrest, so precision in language became a matter of state security. Treaties were recorded with meticulous care, and the minutes of important meetings were preserved to provide a lasting record of agreements and obligations. This written consistency prevented the slow drift of oral promises and memories, locking policy into a permanent form that officials anywhere could reference. The entire sprawling empire relied on this network of trusted text, a web of words that held the entire structure together. This great unifying project, however, demanded more than just scribes and scrolls. Its ultimate success would hinge on a revolutionary technology for mass-producing the written word itself. A scroll unfurls across a table, a continuous and cumbersome stream of text. Now hold that same information in your hand, bound neatly between two covers. This was the quiet revolution of the Codex, the ancestor of our modern book, and it fundamentally rewired how humanity interacted with knowledge. The shift was not merely one of convenience, but of cognitive structure. A scroll demanded linear reading, a journey from beginning to end. A codex with its separate pages allowed for random access. You could flip directly to a specific chapter, compare passages side by side, and navigate the text as a landscape rather than a single road. This new format invited a more active, interrogative relationship with the written word. It transformed reading from a passive recitation into a dynamic conversation. Early Christian communities were among the first to grasp the profound potential of this new technology. For a faith spreading rapidly across the vast and diverse Roman world, the Codex was a perfect tool. It was far more portable and durable than a fragile papyrus scroll, easily carried by travelers and missionaries along trade routes. More importantly, its structure made it easier to reference specific teachings and letters during worship and debate, helping to standardize their scriptures and consolidate their message. This practical advantage in dissemination played a crucial, if often overlooked, role in the faith's expansion. The true power of the Codex, however, was its capacity for organization. For the first time, you could add a table of contents, page numbers, and even a rudimentary index. A Roman lawyer could now quickly cross-reference legal precedents. A scholar could compare philosophical arguments from different texts without unrolling a dozen separate scrolls across a vast desk. This efficiency in retrieval accelerated the pace of scholarship, law, and administration, creating a new class of professional who relied on rapid access to information. Knowledge was becoming not just something to possess, but something to navigate with precision. As the Codex became more common, it triggered a subtle decentralization of power. The great libraries of Alexandria and Rome had been monumental centers, concentrating scrolls in one physical location. But a codex was compact. A merchant could assemble a personal collection of volumes on geography, accounting, and trade law. A noble family could curate its own library, preserving histories and scientific texts. Knowledge was seeping out of the fortified institutions and into private homes, fostering a more distributed intellectual life. This was the quiet beginning of a democratization of learning, a shift in the very geography of knowing that would one day prepare the world for an even greater information explosion. The chill of a stone scriptorium was more than a physical feeling. It was a shelter from the world's noise. While kingdoms rose and fell beyond the monastery walls, a solitary monk worked by the soft glow of an oil lamp, his breath misting the air as he traced the elegant curves of a Greek letter. His task was not to conquer or to rule, but to recover. With each dip of his quill into handmade ink, he was pulling a fragment of a fading world back from the edge of silence. The texts he copied were not always sacred scripture. They were manuals on how to predict the seasons by the stars, guides for treating illness with herbs, and dialogues from thinkers who had been gone for 1,000 years. This was the profound, quiet labor of the medieval scriptorium, a gentle resistance against loss that would one day change everything. This work was far from a solitary hobby. It was a refined, structured process perfected over generations. Within the scriptorium, every individual had a distinct role. One monk prepared the writing surface, working with prepared materials until they were smooth and ready. Another mixed inks from natural sources, creating a deep black meant to last for centuries. The scribe himself was the centerpiece, his hand trained to produce a steady script, letter by careful letter, for hours on end. Finally, an illuminator might add intricate designs in vibrant colors made from ground minerals and precious pigments, turning the page into a work of art. This careful organization was not for speed alone. It was a system of thoughtful review. It ensured that every copy was correct, clear, and beautiful, a trustworthy vessel for the learning it carried. Why would these communities dedicate such immense care to keeping the works of classical thinkers and early scientists? The answer lies in a practical sense that all understanding, whether called sacred or worldly, held value for a stable society. A copied text on Roman farming could mean the difference between a good harvest and hardship for nearby villages. A preserved star chart helped set the dates for religious festivals and planting times, weaving everyday needs into the pattern of spiritual life. The monastery became the library, the learning place, and the memory center of its time. It protected the practical and thoughtful tools needed for community growth, ensuring that the hard-earned wisdom of earlier days was not forgotten but held in safekeeping. This steady, quiet effort created a wide, connected network of knowledge long before the idea existed. Each monastery, from the green hills of Ireland to the sun-warmed plains of Italy, acted as a point in this gentle web. Their libraries became treasure houses not of gold but of possibility. The works of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medical observations of Galen, all rested peacefully on these shelves, waiting. They were waiting for the moment when a new class of merchants and scholars, emerging in busy medieval towns, would develop a hunger for this preserved learning. The patient, focused scribe copying plotter was, though he could never know it, laying the essential groundwork for an intellectual revival still centuries away. His quiet commitment ensured that when Europe was ready to rediscover reason and inquiry, the foundational texts would be there, ready to inspire the Renaissance. And this very act of keeping knowledge safe would soon demand a technology bold enough to open the world of the written word to everyone. The quiet dedication of the monastery scribe created a precious reservoir of knowledge, but it was within the bustling, noisy halls of the first universities that this reservoir began to flow outward and change the world. From the cathedral schools of the 12th century emerged a revolutionary idea, the university, an institution that would systematize higher learning and create an entirely new class of educated professionals. Think of the vibrant, often chaotic intellectual life at the University of Paris. Here, in a warren of lecture halls and student lodgings, masters and students from every corner of Europe gathered to debate the recovered works of Aristotle and the fine points of canon law. They were not just memorizing old texts, they were forging a shared body of knowledge and a common method of inquiry that transcended the local loyalties of village or kingdom. This was the birth of a truly international intellectual community. The curriculum itself was a carefully designed engine for producing capable minds. It centered on the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, trained students to use language with precision, construct persuasive arguments, and think with disciplined reason. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, provided the mathematical and scientific foundation for understanding the natural world. A graduate of this system was not merely a scholar, he was a skilled administrator, equipped with the exact talents needed to staff the burgeoning bureaucracies of kings and popes. These were the individuals who would draft complex treaties, manage intricate royal finances, and provide reasoned advice on matters of state policy. They brought a new level of professional competence to governance, turning the raw power of a monarch into a sustainable, well-managed state. Beyond training administrators, the universities became dynamic centers for the translation and study of long-forgotten texts. Scholars, often working in the cultural crossroads of places like Spain and Sicily, pored over Arabic and Greek manuscripts, reintroducing advanced mathematics, sophisticated medical knowledge, and detailed astronomical tables to the West. This was not a passive recovery, it was an active absorption of technical knowledge that would soon fuel monumental innovations. The improved mathematics would refine accounting and engineering. The recovered astronomy would provide the celestial charts for a new age of exploration, and the medical texts would slowly transform approaches to health and healing. These hubs of learning were more than libraries, they were crucibles where knowledge was not just preserved but actively advanced, debated, and expanded. This created a powerful new dynamic between scholarship and state power. A king no longer had to rely solely on the advice of his nobles. He could draw from a growing pool of university-trained lawyers and diplomats. The very existence of this educated class raised the sophistication of statecraft, enabling more complex economic planning and more ambitious foreign policies. The knowledge being debated in the lecture halls of Oxford and Bologna was the same knowledge that would soon chart unknown oceans and design the machines of a new world, setting the stage for an era of global connection. A single map could promise an empire. In the quiet study of a European prince, a newly drawn chart of the African coastline was not just a navigational aid, it was a document of pure ambition. This was the ultimate fusion of preserved scholarship and practical daring. a moment when the theoretical knowledge safeguarded for centuries in monasteries and universities was unleashed upon the oceans. At Portugal's Sagres School, this collaboration became a formal strategy. Cartographers fresh from studying Ptolemy's ancient Geographia worked alongside sailors who had seen the strange currents and shifting stars of southern waters. Astronomers provided tables for calculating latitude, while shipwrights designed vessels capable of surviving the open Atlantic. This was not a random gathering of adventurers. It was a deliberate think tank where every scrap of knowledge, whether from a 2,000-year-old text or a captain's fresh logbook, was integrated into a single, actionable plan. The unknown was systematically transformed into the known, and then into a foundation for new ventures. The tools of this great expansion were themselves products of applied learning. The astrolabe, adapted from earlier Islamic designs, allowed a navigator to find his position by the sun and stars, turning the featureless sea into a measurable grid. The magnetic compass, a Chinese innovation that traveled west along trade routes, provided a constant reference point regardless of weather or visibility. These instruments, combined with the new caravel ships that could sail efficiently against the wind, were the physical manifestations of a culture that invested in knowledge. They were the keys that unlocked the world. For the monarchs funding these voyages, a detailed map was the ultimate strategic asset. It allowed them to visualize not just geography, but future claims of sovereignty, potential sources of wealth, and the supply lines needed to sustain distant outposts. They were drawing the lines of future influence on parchment, planning overseas enterprises with a confidence that would have been impossible just a generation before. The voyage of Vasco da Gama to India or Columbus's transatlantic crossing were not just acts of individual courage, they were the logical outcomes of this systematic, knowledge-driven approach. The return on this intellectual investment was staggering, reshaping global trade and concentrating immense power and wealth in European hands. But this sudden, dramatic expansion of the known world created a problem of a scale never before seen. How could a king in Lisbon possibly manage the daily affairs of a trading post in Goa, or a viceroy govern a territory months away by sea? The very knowledge that had created these global empires now demanded a new kind of knowledge, a system for administering a world that had suddenly grown much, much larger. The rhythmic clatter of a printing press was the sound of the world accelerating. In a workshop in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg's invention did more than produce beautiful Bibles. It re-engineered the very flow of information. For the first time, an idea could be replicated not dozens but thousands of times with perfect consistency and sent racing along the trade routes of Europe. The written word, once a treasure locked in monastic and princely libraries, was suddenly set free, becoming a common commodity that could shape the consciousness of an entire population. This was a force multiplier for imperial power on an unimaginable scale. Governments were among the first to grasp the profound utility of this new machine. They could now print thousands of identical copies of legal codes and administrative manuals, dispatching them to every corner of their realm. A local magistrate in a distant province no longer had to interpret a unique, hand-copied version of the law. He had the exact same text as his counterpart in the capital. This created an unprecedented level of standardization, tightening the administrative grip of the central state and forging a more unified sense of national identity among people who might never meet their king, but who all lived under the same printed statutes. Official proclamations and carefully framed reports could be circulated to shape public opinion, turning the press into a powerful instrument for building consensus and legitimizing authority. The engine of exploration was supercharged by this torrent of printed material. A single navigator's account of a newfound coastline could be typeset, printed, and distributed to shipyards and sponsors across the continent within months, not years. Detailed technical manuals on shipbuilding and navigation were published and studied, allowing for the rapid, standardized improvement of maritime technology. Cartographers printed updated maps that incorporated the latest discoveries, each new chart fueling the ambitions of the next adventurer. This created a powerful feedback loop where new knowledge spurred further expeditions, which in turn generated even more knowledge to be printed and disseminated. The coordinated effort required to sustain global empires, from supplying distant colonies to raising capital for new ventures, now ran on a constant stream of printed instructions, reports, and promotional pamphlets. Yet this new information ecosystem, so expertly harnessed by rulers, contained a revolutionary seed. The same press that standardized royal law could also print critiques of the crown. The technology that unified a nation around a common language could also give a voice to dissenting religious and political thinkers. By placing the power of mass communication into many hands, the printing press began to erode the monopoly on information that had long been a pillar of monolithic authority. It created a public sphere where ideas could clash and evolve outside of royal courts, setting the stage for a future where knowledge would not just build empires, but would also empower the people to question them. This great dispersal of thought, however, was just the beginning of an even greater transformation, one that would see information itself break free from the page entirely. A single printed pamphlet could now challenge the authority of a pope. The very technology that allowed kings to standardize their laws also gave a voice to those who questioned the entire foundation of their power. As the flow of information accelerated across Europe, it carried not only official decrees but also a rising tide of new ideas that began to reshape the unity of Christendom itself. In Rome, the rapid spread of printed works examining church practices and exploring different viewpoints created a profound moment of reflection. These were not quiet debates among scholars in a university hall. They were widely shared conversations that could be read aloud in a town square, discussed in a merchant's home, or passed from one curious reader to another. This decentralized flow of knowledge directly supported movements like the Reformation, transforming a theological discussion into a cultural force that would reshape the map of Europe and influence generations to come. The response from established powers was swift and systematic. The Vatican created an index of forbidden books, a formal list of publications considered outside accepted teachings, and established review boards to guide what could be printed. Monarchs granted exclusive printing patents to loyal guilds, creating a structured publishing system designed to focus the production of acceptable knowledge. Their goal was to manage the spread of challenging thought, to guide the new power of mass communication toward established channels, but the press had already distributed the power to inform widely. Independent printing operations flourished in sympathetic cities, producing pamphlets and tracts that authorities could never fully contain. This created a fresh, alternative circuit of information that operated alongside the official one. This situation encouraged empires to develop more thoughtful approaches for engaging with public discussion. They expanded networks to understand local conversations, refined systems for observing printers and booksellers, and used their own presses to share a constant stream of supportive perspectives. Yet this very effort to guide knowledge had an unexpected outcome. It nurtured a culture of careful consideration and lively exchange among a growing literate public. When people learn about restricted reading, it often sparks a genuine interest in alternative perspectives. The act of exploring and discussing various texts became a form of intellectual independence, gradually building a public space where authority was no longer simply accepted, but could be thoughtfully examined. The guidance of challenging knowledge thus became a central, ongoing focus of leadership. It was no longer enough to command armies and collect taxes. A ruler now had to maintain a continuous conversation for the understanding of his subjects' minds. This situation would only deepen as the next great opportunity for established order emerged not from theology, but from the observatory and the laboratory, where a new scientific way of seeing the world would reconsider the very cosmos humanity occupied. A new kind of power was emerging from the laboratory and the observatory. The 17th century did not just change what humanity knew, it changed how it knew, replacing ancient authority with a relentless focus on observation, experiment, and mathematical proof. This scientific revolution offered empires a fresh and formidable toolkit for understanding the natural world, intensifying their global rivalry into a contest not just of arms but of intellect. In London, the Royal Society became a nerve center for this new way of thinking. Fellows like Isaac Newton corresponded with thinkers across Europe, sharing breakthroughs in physics and astronomy through a constant stream of letters and published papers. Their abstract theories had immediate, world-changing applications. The quest to understand planetary motion, for instance, directly fueled the race to build a more accurate marine clock. A ship's captain who could determine his longitude at sea could navigate with a precision that turned vast oceans into manageable highways, giving the British Navy a decisive strategic advantage over its competitors. This empirical mindset was loaded onto every exploration vessel. Botanists and geologists now sailed alongside naval officers, their mission to systematically catalog, collect, and classify. A previously unknown plant was no longer just a curiosity. It was a potential commodity to be identified, studied, and transplanted to a colonial plantation. A strange rock formation was analyzed for mineral content, revealing new sources of wealth for the imperial treasury. Foreign landscapes were thus transformed into organized, exploitable assets, their ecosystems carefully studied and reassembled for economic gain thousands of miles away. This process turned global biodiversity into a vast, open-air resource for European markets. Beyond the tangible resources, this new approach generated a powerful ideology. The methodical accumulation of evidence created an unshakable belief in progress and improvement, a narrative that could justify imperial expansion as a civilizing mission. The language of science provided a framework for presenting exploration as a transfer of knowledge and order to lands deemed in need of development. This ideological perspective was reinforced by very real advances in military technology and medicine, which directly enhanced the ability to project influence and sustain distant outposts in unfamiliar environments. The pursuit of pure knowledge and the pursuit of raw power became a single, intertwined endeavor, formally recognized and funded by the state through new academies and learned societies. These institutions were the final piece in the architecture of a new kind of empire, one built as much on data and discovery as on diplomacy and force. The French Academy of Sciences was not a quiet retreat for thinkers, but a strategic workshop for national ambition. Under the patronage of Louis XIV, savants received pensions and laboratories not for abstract curiosity, but to solve the most pressing problems of the state. Their mandate was direct: to determine longitude for the Navy, to improve the quality of textiles in royal manufactories, and to standardize weights and measures across the kingdom. This was knowledge engineered for influence, turning scholarly inquiry into a direct fuel for economic productivity and military reach. The Academy became the centralized mind of the modern state, a place where the intellectual labor of the nation could be organized, funded, and directed toward a common purpose. This model of state-sponsored research created a new professional class, the scientist and the engineer as public servants. Freed from the need to seek private patronage, these individuals could dedicate their lives to systematic study. Cartographers produced ever more accurate maps of colonial territories. Chemists developed new materials and dyes for industry, and statisticians began to quantify the nation's population and resources. Their work provided the raw data and technical innovations necessary for effective governance, transforming the complex realities of a vast territory into orderly columns of numbers and precise diagrams. This was the intellectual machinery that enabled a minister in Paris to make informed decisions about tax policy, military logistics, and public works, all based on reliable information gathered by the state's own experts. By sponsoring great expeditions and publishing official journals, these academies helped weave a global network of knowledge, yet one that was carefully filtered through national interests. A botanical discovery in the Americas was quickly relayed back to the Academy, studied for its potential use, and often kept from rival powers. The race to chart the stars or map the Pacific was not merely a scientific pursuit. It was an extension of imperial competition, where every new piece of information translated into a potential commercial or strategic advantage. This system accelerated the pace of discovery while simultaneously ensuring that the fruits of that discovery served the state first. The legacy of this centralized approach to knowledge is profoundly visible in the great imperial archives that followed, vast repositories where the world was catalogued, not for its own sake, but for the sake of order. A single sheet of paper in a Spanish archive could determine the fate of a family living thousands of miles across the ocean. This was the quiet, formidable power of the Imperial Archive, a fortress of information built not for learning but for lasting control. Beyond the grand libraries of scholars stood these vast repositories of administrative memory, where every land grant, tax record, and census entry was collected, categorized, and stored. The Archivo General de Indias in Seville became the central brain of Spain's New World Empire, a physical mountain of paperwork that allowed officials in Madrid to oversee territories they would never see. Through this relentless flow of documents, a bureaucrat could track the production of a silver mine in Peru, approve a marriage in Mexico City, or authorize the movement of a ship from the Philippines. This was governance at a distance, made possible by the belief that if something was written down, it could be understood, and if it was understood, it could be directed. These archives functioned as tools of constant, quiet observation. The meticulous registration of individuals, from their ethnic classifications to their property holdings, created a system of total visibility for the state. A local official in a remote province knew that his every decision could be reviewed against a file kept in a distant capital. This awareness alone created a powerful effect, a self-regulating discipline that reinforced imperial authority without the need for constant physical oversight. The very act of classification gave the state a profound grip on reality. By deciding what information was valuable enough to record and how to categorize it, officials created an official version of the world. A complex indigenous culture with its own rich oral history and land stewardship traditions could be simplified into an entry in a registry or a map of open territory. The archive did not just reflect reality, it actively constructed a new one that served the empire's needs, systematically setting aside other ways of knowing. This bureaucratic focus on documentation represents the ultimate expression of knowledge as a pure instrument of influence. To control the records was to control history itself, to define law, and to assign identity. The painstakingly kept logs of the Spanish Empire were not neutral accounts. They were active tools in a long-term project of cultural shaping. Yet this very system of oversight inevitably created its own counterpoint. The same ledgers that documented land transfers also, often between the lines, preserved traces of the vibrant cultures they sought to describe. In the careful script of a court scribe, you might find a native leader's petition for the return of traditional lands, a quiet act of persistence recorded within the empire's own bureaucratic machine. This struggle over the written record reveals a deeper truth, that the power to define what is known has always been a central point of tension, a dynamic that would only grow as information began to flow through entirely new and unpredictable channels. A colonial administrator saw only a bundle of knotted strings, a simple artifact from a community under new governance. But for the Andean people keeping it safe, this quipu was a living record of their ancestry, their harvests, and the very structure of their society, preserved in a language of chords that Spanish authorities could not interpret. This quiet act of preservation was not mere nostalgia. It was a deliberate strategy of intellectual endurance. Across the world, communities experiencing imperial expansion protected their own ways of understanding, embedding vital information in spoken histories, ceremonial songs, and practical skills passed carefully from one generation to the next. A healer in West Africa might hold hundreds of medicinal plant uses in memory, creating a living library that no outside official could ever remove. These were not just alternative facts, they were entire alternative systems for understanding the world, deeply connected to a specific place and its natural cycles. This local knowledge often proved to be profoundly resilient and adaptive. While colonial agricultural systems frequently introduced single crops that strained the land, indigenous farming practices, refined over centuries, understood the value of crop diversity and rotation, techniques we now see as essential to caring for the earth. The deliberate overlooking of these local knowledge systems was therefore a strategic choice. By challenging the intellectual foundations of a culture, by discouraging its languages and dismissing its practices, an empire could more easily introduce its own logic of governance, property, and identity. It was an attempt to separate a people from their own past and their own landscape, making them more manageable within an unfamiliar framework. The survival of these ways of knowing, often through periods of difficulty, shows that the story of knowledge is not a simple narrative of one system replacing another. It is a story of continuous adaptation, a subtle and ongoing process where the power to define what counts as valid knowledge is itself a central point of tension. The quiet dedication of the quipu keeper, the healer, and the storyteller ensured that other models of existence continued, offering different answers to the most fundamental human questions. And this very contest over the control of knowledge would soon find itself magnified on a global scale, as the next great communication technology began to weave the world into a single, interconnected system. A coded telegram could now cross an ocean in minutes, not months. This was the new reality for imperial administration, a profound compression of time and distance that fundamentally altered the relationship between a capital and its farthest territories. The Roman cursus publicus, with its network of relay stations and fast horses, was once the pinnacle of long-distance control, but its messages still moved at the pace of a galloping horse. Compare this to a Victorian official stationed in a remote part of India. He could receive a detailed query from London in the morning, consult local records, and dispatch a coded response by afternoon, all within a single day. This velocity of command created an empire that felt simultaneously vast and intimately connected, a system where decisions made in Whitehall could echo instantly in Bombay. The strategic advantages were immense. News of a local situation could be telegraphed to a regional command, allowing for the rapid deployment of personnel to address matters before they could grow into a wider conflict. Global financial markets, once subject to the uncertainties of wind and wave, could now be managed in near real time, with commodity prices and exchange rates flashing along submarine cables that crisscrossed the seabed. This made imperial economies more reactive and resilient, able to adjust to shortages or surpluses with unprecedented speed. Yet this very efficiency forged a chain of new vulnerabilities. The entire system relied on a few critical hubs, central stations where undersea cables came ashore or major overland lines converged. A single point of failure, whether from a technical fault or deliberate action, could sever an empire's nervous system, isolating entire continents from the flow of imperial instruction. The speed of information itself could become a liability. A report stripped of its full context and arriving with startling immediacy might trigger a hasty decision that cooler heads, given time for reflection, would have avoided. The Telegraph did not just transmit words, it transmitted pressure, forcing officials to make weighty judgments at a pace the ancient world never knew. This relentless quest for faster, more reliable communication was a constant driver of imperial innovation, a race to tighten the administrative grip that ultimately wove the first fragile threads of our modern interconnected world. And this legacy of centralized control through technology would soon face its greatest challenge, not from a rival empire, but from a new network designed to have no center at all. A straight line on a map drawn in a distant European capital can divide a single ethnic group or force historical rivals into an uneasy political union. This is the lasting legacy of imperial knowledge systems, the administrative blueprints that were imposed upon the world and which continue to define our modern reality. When the great empires of the 19th and 20th centuries receded, they did not simply vanish. They left behind the very structures through which we now organize our globe. The borders of many nations in Africa and the Middle East were not the result of local consensus or geographical logic. They were the products of negotiations between foreign powers, lines sketched across maps by colonial cartographers who had never walked the land. These arbitrary divisions, created for administrative convenience, often overlooked ancient cultural landscapes and traditional territories, planting the seeds for tensions that would continue for generations. The modern map, in so many ways, is a palimpsest, with the faint, firm lines of imperial planning still visible beneath the surface of independent nations. The power of these systems extends far beyond territorial lines, reaching into the very language of power itself. In dozens of post-colonial states across Africa and Asia, the official tongue of government, higher education, and high-level commerce remains that of the former imperial ruler. This is not a neutral historical artifact. It is a continuing effect of deliberate policies that elevated one language above all others, creating a lasting barrier. Access to political influence and advanced careers often requires fluency in this imported language, which can remain out of reach for many, perpetuating earlier hierarchies under a new name. The imperial project of linguistic unification, once used to administer a diverse realm, has left a complex inheritance, shaping national identity and determining who gets to speak and be heard within the halls of modern power. This architectural influence is equally visible in our global institutions. The United Nations, with its General Assembly and Security Council, mirrors the diplomatic congresses where empires once negotiated their spheres of influence. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund operate on bureaucratic principles and models of economic development that are direct descendants of imperial trade and finance networks. The very concept of international law, with its focus on state sovereignty and diplomatic recognition, emerged from the need to manage relations between expanding empires. The knowledge infrastructures of the past, designed for centralized control and global management, were not discarded. They were repurposed, their frameworks providing the skeleton for the new world order that emerged after the Age of Empire. This complex inheritance invites us to consider a critical question that has echoed through every chapter of our story: who ultimately controls knowledge and for what purpose? The systems we have inherited were largely designed to consolidate influence, to classify and manage populations, and to organize resource flows. Today, we live within these inherited structures, even as we strive to use them for new ends, for cooperation, development, and global well-being. This enduring tension between knowledge as an instrument of direction and knowledge as a tool for empowerment did not fade with the age of empire. It has simply migrated, finding a new and vastly more powerful expression in the digital networks that now connect us all. A medieval king's archive would have fit within a single stone chamber, but today's equivalent spans continents, housed in humming, anonymous buildings that use more electricity than entire cities. This is the new Library of Alexandria, a global network of server farms where our digital lives are carefully recorded and preserved. Every search query, every social media like, every online purchase becomes a single line in an immense and constantly growing ledger. This data is the new clay tablet, the new imperial record, and it holds a power its collectors understand all too well. Corporations study these patterns to anticipate our interests, shaping the marketplace around our predicted behaviors. Political efforts use similar insights to craft messages that resonate with specific groups, reaching voters with a precision that was once the stuff of science fiction. The stewardship of this digital archive offers a form of influence that is both subtle and pervasive, a quiet guidance of public thought and private choice on a scale no ancient ruler could have imagined. The Internet promised a great sharing of knowledge, and in many ways it has delivered. A student in a remote village can access the same academic papers as a professor at Oxford, a reality that would have brought a tear of joy to the eye of a medieval monk. Yet this very openness has fostered a new kind of centralization. A handful of digital platforms now function as the primary squares for global conversation, their algorithms acting as the unseen architects of public discourse. These lines of code, the product of immense intellectual labor, decide which voices are amplified and which are quieted. They connect us to like-minded individuals, but they can also isolate us in echo chambers, reinforcing our existing views and deepening societal divides. The role these private companies play in shaping culture and even electoral outcomes echoes the influence once held by state-sponsored academies, yet their reach is arguably more personal and immediate. This presents us with a profound and familiar tension. The same tools that empower grassroots movements and give a voice to the marginalized can also be used to spread uncertainty and observe disagreement. The ability to instantly organize a community for a noble cause exists alongside the capacity to influence a population with sophisticated campaigns. We are therefore forced to ask again the oldest question in our long story: who controls knowledge and to what end? The digital age has not abolished the ancient link between information and influence. It has merely rewritten the rules on a planetary scale. The new empires are not defined by territory alone, but by their command over the streams of data that now constitute our shared reality. And as we stand at this latest crossroads, we must wonder if the very nature of knowledge itself is changing, transforming from a foundation for understanding into a currency to be traded and a tool to be used. A Hollywood blockbuster does more than entertain. It carries a nation's language and lifestyle into theaters across the globe. This is the quiet engine of modern influence, a form of power built not on force but on genuine appeal. The concept is called soft power, and it represents a fundamental shift in how states extend their reach. When a Korean pop song becomes a global phenomenon, it does not just sell records. It makes an entire culture fascinating and desirable to millions of people, building a reservoir of goodwill that can smooth the path for diplomatic talks and open new markets for trade. This cultural magnetism creates a foundation of affinity that is often more durable and cost-effective than any military alliance. At the heart of this strategy are the world's great universities. Every year, students from every corner of the planet travel to institutions in the United States and Europe, drawn by the promise of a world-class education. They absorb not only academic knowledge but also the cultural and political values of their host country. When they return home as engineers, entrepreneurs, and future leaders, they often carry a lasting connection to the place where they studied. They become informal ambassadors, their personal success subtly promoting the system that helped shape them. This long-term investment in educating the world's brightest minds creates a global network of influence that extends for generations. The push to make a nation's language, legal frameworks, and technical standards the international norm is a contemporary version of an ancient imperial impulse. It is the desire to make one's own way of organizing the world the default setting for global interaction. When an international contract is written under a specific country's commercial law, or when a global industry adopts one nation's technical specifications, it creates a form of structural power that guides international behavior from within. This is the modern equivalent of building a great library, a project of making a particular knowledge system so ubiquitous that it becomes the invisible architecture of global affairs. The competition for hearts and minds through film, music, and education is therefore a deeply strategic endeavor, one whose quiet, long-term effects we are only beginning to understand. A museum display case in London or Berlin holds more than a beautiful sculpture. It holds a deep and unresolved question about the very nature of cultural ownership. The historical process by which empires gathered knowledge and artifacts from other peoples was rarely a simple exchange. It was often an act of cultural translation, where meaningful objects and specialized wisdom were interpreted within a different system of value and sometimes used to support broader imperial ambitions. This legacy raises profound ethical questions that we are still working to answer today. Who truly holds a culture's heritage? Who has the right to share its story? The ongoing conversation around artifacts like the Elgin marbles or the Benin bronzes reflects this larger dialogue. These objects were taken from their places of origin during a time of colonial influence, and today the nations that created them earnestly seek their homecoming. For the communities connected to them, these are not simply artworks to be viewed in a faraway museum. They are essential pieces of a living cultural identity, physical ties to those who came before and to a history that experienced disruption. Their absence can feel like an open question, while their return represents a movement toward cultural reconnection and the mending of a shared memory. The museum case becomes a quiet space of reflection over who guides the narrative of history. This pattern of gathering extends well beyond physical items into the world of ideas. Consider the detailed understanding of medicinal plants held by indigenous communities, knowledge cultivated over countless generations through close observation and lived practice. In more recent times, this local insight has sometimes been studied by outside researchers, contributing to the creation of valuable pharmaceutical treatments. Yet the original stewards of this knowledge have not always received acknowledgement or fair participation. Their intellectual gifts can become part of a global system from which they themselves might not fully benefit. This is knowledge sometimes viewed as an open resource rather than a cultural inheritance to be respected through cooperation. Addressing these complex historical questions calls for more than the physical homecoming of certain objects, as meaningful as that can be. It invites a deeper reconsideration of how we honor, exchange, and acknowledge knowledge in a world shaped by its past. We are being asked to shift from a long-standing approach of gathering toward a fresh ethic of collaboration. This means creating guidelines that ensure source communities are true partners in exploration, that their agreement is respectfully obtained, and that they participate fully in any positive outcomes that grow from their contributions. It involves revisiting the legal and intellectual frameworks that have often supported large institutions over local wisdom keepers. This thoughtful reflection is not only about understanding the past. It is the necessary groundwork for creating a more balanced and genuinely shared global knowledge space for times to come. The hope is to build a system where diverse ways of understanding can live side by side and enrich each other, not through control, but through mutual regard and common purpose. As we stand at this turning point, we must consider what new forms of partnership are possible and how we can make certain that the great library of human understanding is tended not by one perspective, but by many. The code of a single algorithm now holds more potential influence than the entire archive of a medieval kingdom. We are constructing a new kind of mind, built on the accumulated digital record of our entire species. Artificial intelligence systems trained on every available text, image, and data point are beginning to suggest medical treatments, optimize global supply chains, and propose solutions to intricate scientific challenges. This represents a concentration of intellectual power unlike anything before, a tool that could help us manage the complexities of a global society, or, if guided by narrow interests, create systems of oversight and control of unprecedented subtlety and scale. The entities that design and direct these algorithms will hold a profound ability to shape our shared reality, making the ancient struggle over who controls knowledge more urgent than ever. This technological leap coincides with a new frontier of biological influence. The emerging power to edit genes and engineer living systems grants a form of authority over life's very blueprint, a responsibility that surpasses the territorial ambitions of history's greatest empires. We can now contemplate altering species, reshaping ecosystems, and directing our own evolutionary path. These capabilities arrive with a host of profound questions. Who decides which traits are desirable? How do we ensure that such powerful tools do not deepen existing inequalities? The answers will determine whether this knowledge becomes a source of healing and sustainability or a new mechanism for division. The lessons of our long journey from scroll to server are remarkably clear. The civilizations that flourished were those that turned knowledge into a shared foundation, not a guarded fortress. Societies that encourage open inquiry, that protect diverse ways of knowing, and that invest in widespread education create an environment where innovation and resilience can thrive. They harness the collective intelligence of their people, turning challenges into opportunities for growth. In contrast, systems that seek to monopolize information, that dismiss alternative perspectives, or that restrict the flow of ideas historically face internal stagnation and eventual decline. The great library of human understanding is no longer a physical place. It is a dynamic global network, and its future depends on the ethical frameworks we build today. The fundamental challenge we inherit is not a technological one, but a human one. It is the enduring choice between wielding knowledge as an instrument of dominance or as a tool for common benefit. The next chapter of our civilization will be written by those who understand that true power lies not in hoarding what we know, but in wisely sharing the capacity to learn. The clay tablet and the silicon chip are separated by 5,000 years, yet they serve the same profound purpose. They are both vessels for the most potent force in human history, the recorded word. Our journey from scroll to empire reveals a single, unbroken thread. The story of how knowledge, once captured, becomes the primary instrument for building and maintaining power. The great libraries and quiet scriptoria were never mere storehouses. They were the active forges where the raw material of information was shaped into the tools of administration, the foundations of law, and the bonds of shared identity. Every leap from the codex to the printing press accelerated this process, expanding the reach of the state and the scope of its vision. Now we stand at the latest turning point in this ancient story, holding devices in our hands that contain more information than the great library of Alexandria. We are saturated with data, connected by a global network that hums with the collective knowledge of our species. This is our legacy, the culmination of that long march from the first marks on a clay ledger. The societies of the future will not be measured in square miles, but in the quality of their data and the wisdom of their understanding. The critical question before us is not technological, but deeply human. Will we use these powerful new tools to build a world of enlightenment, fostering open inquiry and shared progress? Or will we construct a system of subtle influence where knowledge is a currency for the few and a means of guidance over the many? The history we have traced together offers a clear lesson. Civilizations that treat knowledge as a common foundation to be shared tend to flourish with innovation and resilience. Those that seek to monopolize it, to build walls around information, often find themselves facing limits to growth. The responsibility now rests with us, not as subjects of an empire, but as its architects. What kind of intellectual world do you wish to build? I invite you to share your perspective in the conversation below.